Once again, greetings everybody. So let's get started like we normally do. Short period of bell meditation. So wherever you are behind your avatar, I want you to get into a nice meditation posture. And as I ring the Ching bell here in Second Life, I just want you to focus on that sound. Focus on the sound of the bell. And the idea is we just want to open up our ears, right? Get that deep listening going today so we can absorb some Dharma. Chances are you'll get distracted. Happens to all of us. And when it does, I just want you to gently remind yourself and go back to focusing on the sound of the bell. It doesn't matter how many times you have to do that. Just continue to do it, and you'll do it less and less. So, give you a moment, get into a nice meditation posture. We'll begin at the sound of the bell. I go for refuge to the Buddha, the teacher. I go for refuge to the Dharma, the teaching. I go for refuge to the Sangha, the taught. I take refuge in the Buddha. I take refuge in the Dharma. I take refuge in the Sangha. I have taken refuge in the Buddha. I have taken refuge in the Dharma. I have taken refuge in the Sangha. 3 pure precepts. Cease to do harm. Do only good. Do good for others. Bodhisattva vow. However innumerable all beings are, I vow to lead them all. However inexhaustible my delusions are, I vow to extinguish them all. However immeasurable the Dharma teachings are, I vow to master them all. However endless the Buddha's way is, I vow to follow it completely. Swaha. All right, so the subject today is pushing buttons. And I need to start out by putting a name out here. Many of you will have seen this name before. He comes up on occasion. So don't need the little mark at the end of the name. It's Roland Marullo. You guys heard me talk about it. He's an author. He wrote a series of 3 books: Breakfast with Buddha, Lunch with Buddha, and Dinner with Buddha. And they all had the same cast of characters. And they're just wonderful books, and I highly recommend them. He also writes a lot about golf. I don't know anything about golf, so I've never read his books about golf. But anyway, in his book, Lunch with Buddha, the second book, there's this really great dialogue between Volya Rinpoche, who is like a sort of Buddhist teacher. When you start reading the books, you get the idea. He's kind of a Buddhist teacher. And then there's Otto, who's his sort of student. And Otto speaks of how his sister, he's speaking to Volya Rinpoche. It's one of these sensei, can you help me out with a problem things. And he speaks of how his sister is always pushing his buttons on particular subjects and particular actions that he takes. And so Volya Rinpoche asked him to explain, what is this buttons? What's this idea of buttons that you're talking about? And this is a question we each have to ask ourselves. What are these buttons? And we've got to arrive at answers that can actually aid us on the noble path. But first, I want to read you the dialogue. It's great dialogue. So, the first person to speak is Volya, and then the second person to speak is Otto. What is this buttons? He asked. Oh, it's an American expression. If you have, a doorbell, for example, you push the button and you get an immediate response. An elevator, a light switch. The expression refers to things that people do that get a response from you. Almost always a negative response. A child refuses to go to bed, for example, and he pushes your buttons. You get frustrated, upset. You might raise your voice. Pissed you on, yes? Off. Pisses you off, or just irritates or annoys. What does buttons come from? What do you mean? What is this buttons? It's a reflex. Certain things irritate certain people. That's all. So just to fill you in, Volya Rinpoche is from somewhere in Russia. He's a Russian Buddhist, strangely enough. Anyway, so I want to begin with the reality that all of us have buttons. Some of us have buttons that stick out and people can easily hit them. Others, we've learned to hide them or they've vanished altogether. Because if you think you don't have buttons, you're deluding yourself. Each of us have buttons. Even the most awakened people have buttons, like the Dalai Lama, for example, has buttons. The seemed experience that most button pushing is done to initiate some negative reaction, it's also kind of a delusion. Buttons just as readily can cause the arising of loving kindness or other wholesome responses. The language of buttons is negative only because most people focus on the unwholesome without much regard to the wholesome. For example, we get our positive button push when we see a really cute kitten, right? That pushes our, button, look at that kitten. Same thing with puppies, babies, right? So we can get that wholesome button push too. But the reality of buttons is that we can rewire them so that pushing the negative, it'll just have little recognizable effect. While pushing the positive can propel us forward to some encompassing and corrective responses. When you guys come here, right, and we all sit together, I begin trying to push your buttons, if you will, by having you meditate. Right? I'm pushing that button to get you into a certain way of being while you're here. That's what rituals of intent do. They're meant to push a particular button to remind us of what we're doing. Well, let's consider the emotion of anger, of being pissed off. as the most universal example of a negative button. I've often talked about recognizing the arising of emotions like anger. And it isn't hard to recognize anger. Shortness of breath, warming of the skin, high blood pressure, and that fight or flight chemicals that get released into the brain. A first step in getting some control over such emotions is learning to recognize that they are arising. Then they can be viewed as just what they are, right? Just an emotional phenomenon. It'll pass. They don't have to be the cause of our actions and thoughts. We can choose to act with thoughtful intent rather than emotional reaction. But what about if an emotion like anger just keeps on arising? Man, every time you turn around, somebody's hitting that button. Well, it takes mindfulness and oftentimes extraordinary effort to resist acting out of such a strong and sometimes overwhelming emotion. It takes work, it takes commitment. There is the danger that it'll take so much effort, time after time after time, that a practitioner just gives up and says, screw it, I'm just going to let the emotion rule. We don't want that to happen. It doesn't have to happen that way. Because that surrender can be avoided by not just being mindful of the arising, but of discovering the button that's causing it and disconnecting it. What is the internal or external action that is pushing that button? Because, by the way, you can push your own buttons. Whatever person, place, or thing, or thought is the button, you can discover it through rigorous self-honesty. Then you work to disconnect it by realizing the cause before it becomes an effect. So you feel the anger bubbling up, you're getting ready to take some action based on that anger, and you go, wait a minute, I want to think about what the cause is. What's the consequence? I want to know before I cause something. What we don't want to overlook is that each of us has positive buttons that cause the arising of dispositions like compassion, yay, generosity of spirit, or acceptance, and all kinds of other positive habits and dispositions that we have. These are the buttons a practitioner looks to wire up stronger, wire it up so that we get a flashing green light and the clarion call of a trumpet whenever those buttons are pushed. Ooh, somebody pushed my loving kindness button? Yay! Let's practice some loving kindness. Generosity of spirit is the button that's pushed most often, say, during the holiday season. And we want to be generous then, right, with family and friends. We want to be generous with charitable giving and volunteering. We want to be generous with our examples of compassion and sincerity and loving kindness. And once that button is pushed, it is important to recognize that other buttons will be activated too. Buttons like compassion, an appropriate view, and intent, and selflessness. These are dispositions that we work to connect so that recognition of need leads to a realization of encompassing and corrective response. So we want to know what our buttons are. We want to figure it out. What pushes them? But we want to do it both for the negative and the positive. This is one reason why, as we get further on our walk along the noble path, we find ourselves starting to congregate with more like people because they push the good buttons, right? Like sitting here in the Sangha, we push buttons like, have you meditated today? Or we push buttons like, thank you for that generosity of spirit in sharing that story. So we're looking for those wholesome buttons to push while we're here. Even when we get into discussions and we don't agree, we're not pushing negative buttons. We're still pushing positive buttons because we're having an open discussion. So Otto goes on with Bullion. He says it's a reflex, that when a button is pushed, there is an unconscious reaction of the body mind. It implies, though, that there can be no control. The reflex is unavoidable given the activation of the button. So push the button, get the action. With experiential verification of the not-self, though, we know that this is not true. What may have been reflexes that lead to negative reactions can become reflexes of positive and affirming responses to situations and experiences. Consciously thinking and acting in encompassing and corrective ways will lead, over time and with effort, to unconsciously, spontaneously responding in ways that engender positive karmic consequences. So when the wholesome button gets pushed, you'll react almost immediately. When the unwholesome button gets pushed, you're going to put a little space there. You're going to say, whoa, wait a minute. Do I need anger right now? Do I need hatred right now? Do I need greed right now? So back to a little dialogue here between Otto and Volia. At this point, it's Otto speaking first. And Otto says, perfect. You don't have buttons, I guess. Oh, millions buttons, he says. Then how come I've never seen them? You breathe, you're buttonless. You're perpetually satisfied. Volia answers with a laugh, the buttons show you the line where you stop. So considering buttons as a wholly negative phenomena, then they do show us when and where to stop, right? Somebody pushes the anger button, we want to stop that. Those are the ones we want to disengage. Anger or racism or hatefulness or craving, right? These kind of buttons, we want to disconnect them. Realizing that we each have positive buttons too, they also can show us where and when to start. So when you get that loving kindness button pushed, practice some loving kindness. When you get that generosity button pushed, practice some generosity. But let's keep in mind, you're just as apt to push your own buttons as somebody else is to push them. That takes even a little deeper level of rigorous self-honesty when you're dealing with pushing your own buttons. You know, buttons like, let's see, what's a good one? Buttons like negative self-image, for example. Or the button that some people have that say, I'm just not as smart as I wish I was. We have all kinds of buttons within us that we push.